The metallic screech of swing chains grinding to an abrupt halt pierced the afternoon air like a wounded animal's cry. 8-year-old Malik's laughter died in his throat as two uniformed figures approached with the swagger of men who'd forgotten the difference between authority and tyranny. The playground, moments before, alive with children's voices, fell into an unnatural silence that made every parent's heart skip a beat. "Hey, you can't swing that high!" Officer Bradley's voice boomed across the small community park, his hand already reaching for the modified swing seat that had been specifically designed for Malik's needs. The boy's legs, affected by mild cerebral palsy, required the additional support that the adaptive equipment provided. But to these two HOA enforcement officers, it looked like nothing more than unauthorized playground equipment. Malik's eyes widened with confusion. He'd been swinging on this same seat for months, installed with the full approval and financial support of the Homeowners Association after his mother had presented medical documentation and engineering specifications. The gentle arc of his movement had been one of pure joy, the kind that every child deserves to experience without question or interruption. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Malik said, his voice small but clear. His hands gripped the safety straps of his adaptive seat, knuckles white with sudden fear. "My mom said I could use this. The HOA said it was okay." Officer Davidson stepped closer, his clipboard clutched like a weapon. "This equipment wasn't authorized. You're vandalizing community property." The absurdity of accusing a child of vandalism for using medically necessary equipment seemed lost on both men, their faces set in the hard lines of officials who had long ago stopped seeing the people they were supposed to serve. From her position on a nearby bench, Alexis Thompson looked up from her phone where she'd been responding to work emails. She wore simple jeans and a lightweight sweater. Nothing that would indicate her true profession or the level of security clearance that allowed her to protect the most powerful person in the free world. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another working mother, stealing a few minutes of quiet while her son played. But something in the officer's tone made her stomach tighten with a familiar dread. She'd seen this before, in countless briefings about community relations and civil rights violations. The escalation pattern was textbook false accusations, intimidation tactics, and the systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals. "Officers, excuse me," Alexis called out, rising from her bench with the fluid grace of someone trained in defensive tactics. "Is there a problem here?" Bradley turned toward her with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, your son has been vandalizing playground equipment. We need to confiscate this unauthorized modification and issue a citation." The word confiscate hit Alexis like a physical blow. She'd spent weeks navigating the bureaucratic maze to get Malik's adaptive swing approved, working with pediatric occupational therapists, safety engineers, and HOA board members to ensure every detail met both medical and legal requirements. The swing wasn't just equipment. It was her son's pathway to the simple joy of childhood play that other children took for granted. "I have all the documentation showing this equipment was approved by the HOA board," Alexis said, her voice measured but firm. "My son has cerebral palsy. This adaptive seat is medically necessary for his safety." Davidson's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "We don't care about your paperwork. Lady, this thing is coming down now." Without warning, he reached for the swing's support chains, his movements aggressive and purposeful. Malik's fear transformed into desperate resistance. "No, please don't take it. I need it to swing." His small hands fought to maintain his grip on the seat, but his compromised motor control made him no match for the adult's strength. What happened next would be captured in perfect detail by the smartwatch on Alexis's wrist, its advanced recording capabilities automatically triggered by her elevated heart rate and the stress indicators that her biometric monitoring system detected. The livestream began without her conscious command, a security feature that had been designed to protect federal agents in the field. Bradley's open palm connected with Malik's cheek, with a sharp crack that echoed across the playground like a gunshot. The 8-year-old's head snapped to the side, tears immediately springing to his eyes as he cried out in pain and shock. "That's what happens when you don't listen to authority," Bradley snarled, his face flushed with anger. "You'll respect our orders or face the consequences." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Parents, who had been watching their own children play, stood frozen in disbelief. Someone's stroller rolled forgotten down a small hill. A dog barked frantically at the sudden tension in the air, sensing the danger that its human companions were still processing. Alexis felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest. In her years of federal service, she'd protected presidents from assassination attempts, coordinated responses to terrorist threats, and faced down armed criminals without flinching. But nothing had prepared her for watching her own child be struck by someone wearing a badge. "You just assaulted my son," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You laid hands on a disabled child for playing on equipment that was legally installed for his use." Davidson was already working to detach the adaptive swing from its mounting points, using a multi-tool to loosen the heavy-duty bolts that had been installed by certified playground equipment specialists. "Your kid needs to learn respect. Maybe a little discipline will teach him to follow the rules." The swing seat came free with a metallic clang, and Davidson tossed it carelessly into the back of their utility cart. The sound of the custom-fabricated medical equipment hitting the metal cart bed made Malik sob harder, his small body shaking with the trauma of losing both his safety and his dignity in the span of minutes. "Furthermore," Bradley continued, pulling out a citation book with theatrical flourish, "you're being fined $2,000 for unauthorized modification of community property and allowing your child to vandalize HOA assets." He scribbled on the citation with aggressive strokes, the pen digging deep enough to leave impressions on the pages beneath. "And if we see your boy on any playground equipment again, he'll be banned from all common areas. Permanently." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Malik would be ostracized from his own community, prevented from playing with his friends, excluded from the outdoor activities that were crucial for his physical therapy and social development. It was a sentence that would effectively imprison a child within the walls of his own home. Alexis looked at her son, whose tear-streaked face bore the red mark of Bradley's hand. She saw the other parents watching from a distance, their faces painted with sympathy, but also relief that it wasn't their child being targeted. She understood their fear, their reluctance to intervene against uniformed authority figures who wielded the power to make life difficult for anyone who crossed them. But they didn't understand who they were dealing with. Alexis reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a black leather credential case. The gold badge inside caught the afternoon sunlight, its eagle and shield design unmistakable to anyone familiar with federal law enforcement. But it was the words printed beneath her photo that made both officers' faces drain of color. "Deputy Director, Presidential Protection Division, United States Secret Service." "Gentlemen," Alexis said, her voice now carrying the full weight of federal authority, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Bradley's swagger evaporated instantly. His eyes darted from the badge to Alexis's face, then to the smartwatch on her wrist, which was displaying a recording indicator that hadn't been there moments before. "You have just committed assault and battery against a minor in the presence of a federal law enforcement officer," Alexis continued, her training taking over. "You have violated his civil rights under color of authority, destroyed medical equipment necessary for his care, and issued fraudulent citations for legally approved accommodations." Davidson's multi-tool clattered to the ground as his hands began to shake. "Ma'am, We were just doing our job. The HOA board said. The HOA board approved this equipment 3 months ago. Alexis interrupted. I have the meeting minutes, the engineering reports, and the medical prescriptions all on file. What you've done here isn't enforcement. It's targeted harassment of a disabled child. She lifted her wrist slightly, and the smartwatch face displayed a small indicator showing that the live stream was active. But more importantly, everything that just happened has been recorded and transmitted in real time to the Department of Homeland Security Operations Center. My biometric monitoring system automatically initiates emergency protocols when I'm in potential danger. The color drained from Bradley's face as the implications sank in. You mean? I mean that approximately 12 minutes ago, when my heart rate spiked and my stress indicators reached critical levels. This incident was flagged as a potential threat to a federal agent and her family. The footage has been reviewed by duty officers, and a response team was dispatched immediately. As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of approaching vehicles began to penetrate the playground's shocked silence. The low rumble of powerful engines grew closer, accompanied by the subtle whine of radio communications crackling through the air. Parents began gathering their children, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Some pulled out phones to record, while others simply stared in fascination at the unfolding drama that would become neighborhood legend. Malik had stopped crying and was watching his mother with wide eyes. He'd never seen her in her professional capacity, never understood the true nature of her work beyond knowing that she helped keep important people safe. But something in her posture, her voice, her commanding presence, made him stand a little straighter despite his fear. "Ma'am, please," Davidson pleaded, his earlier aggression replaced by desperate panic. "We can fix this. We can put the swing back up. We can tear up the citation. Just tell us what you want." Alexis knelt beside Malik, her hand gently touching the red mark on his cheek. "What I want," she said quietly, "is for my son to be able to play safely in his own community without fear of being assaulted by authority figures who abuse their power." The first black SUV rounded the corner with the quiet efficiency of a predator. No sirens, no flashing lights, but the tinted windows and government plates were unmistakable to anyone familiar with federal law enforcement. It was followed by two more identical vehicles, forming a small motorcade that spoke to the seriousness with which the Department of Homeland Security treated threats to its personnel. Bradley and Davidson exchanged panicked glances. They'd gone from being small-town authority figures to potential federal defendants in the span of minutes, and the reality of their situation was beginning to settle in with terrifying clarity. "The response team includes civil rights investigators from the FBI," Alexis explained, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when briefing other agents. "They specialize in cases involving abuse of authority and violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. They'll want to interview both of you, review all relevant documentation, and examine the damaged equipment." The lead SUV's doors opened with synchronized precision, and 4 agents in dark suits emerged. Their movements were economical and professional, the kind of coordinated response that spoke to years of training and experience in high-stakes situations. Agent Sarah Chen, the team leader, approached with her credentials already visible. "Deputy Director Thompson, are you and your son safe?" "We're unharmed, Agent Chen," Alexis replied, unconsciously shifting into the formal language of official reports. "But we have 2 subjects who committed assault and battery against my son, while he was using legally approved adaptive playground equipment." Chen's eyes swept the scene, taking in the overturned swing seat in the utility cart, the citation book still clutched in Bradley's nerveless fingers, and the red mark on Malik's cheek that was clearly visible even from several feet away. "Officers," Chen said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had dealt with similar situations many times before. "I need you to step away from the cart and place your hands where I can see them." The transformation was instant and complete. Bradley and Davidson, who had been swaggering authority figures just minutes before, now stood with their hands raised slightly, their faces pale with the realization that they were no longer in control of the situation. "Agent Rodriguez will read you your rights," Chen continued, nodding to one of her team members. "You're being detained for investigation of civil rights violations under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 242, which makes it a crime for anyone acting under color of law to deprive another person of their constitutional rights." As Agent Rodriguez began the familiar recitation of Miranda rights, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered at the playground's perimeter. They watched in fascination and growing understanding as the federal agents documented the scene with the thoroughness of a major crime investigation. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down from Alexis, stepped forward hesitantly. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "They hit that little boy for no reason. He was just playing on his swing." Other witnesses began to speak up, their voices overlapping in a chorus of outrage and support. The conspiracy of silence that often protected abusive authority figures was crumbling in the face of federal attention and community solidarity. Agent Chen photographed the confiscated swing equipment, documenting the serial numbers and safety certifications that proved its legitimacy. She also took pictures of the fraudulent citation, noting the legal inconsistencies that would be crucial evidence in the prosecution. "Ma'am," she said to Alexis, "we'll need a full statement from you and your son when you're ready. But first, has he been examined by medical personnel?" The question reminded everyone present that regardless of the political and legal implications, an 8-year-old child had been the victim of an assault. The red mark on Malik's cheek was evidence of a crime, not just a professional disagreement. "I want to take him to the pediatrician to document any injuries," Alexis replied. "And I want a full investigation into how these officers were trained and supervised. This kind of behavior doesn't happen in isolation." As Bradley and Davidson were escorted to separate vehicles for transport to the federal building, the playground began to empty of its small crowd. But the impact of what had occurred would ripple through the community for weeks and months to come. That evening, the emergency HOA board meeting was held in the community center, a sterile room with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows on the faces of the assembled residents. The agenda had been hastily revised to address recent incidents involving enforcement personnel, but everyone knew they were really gathered to discuss the federal investigation that had descended upon their quiet neighborhood. Board President Margaret Walsh called the meeting to order with visible nervousness. She'd spent the afternoon fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and concerned residents who wanted to know how their community had become the center of a federal civil rights investigation. "We're here tonight to address the incident that occurred at the playground this afternoon," Walsh began, her voice carefully measured. "As you may know, there has been some confusion regarding the approved adaptive equipment installed for one of our residents." The euphemistic language drew angry murmurs from the assembled crowd. Tom Henderson, whose own daughter played with Malik regularly, stood up without waiting to be recognized. "Margaret, there wasn't any confusion," he said loudly. "Those officers assaulted an 8-year-old boy for using equipment that we all voted to approve. I was at the meeting. I voted yes. We all did." Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of frustration and disbelief. The carefully maintained facade of community harmony was cracking under the pressure of moral outrage. Alexis entered the meeting room just as the arguments were reaching their peak. She'd changed from her casual playground attire into a dark business suit that left no doubt about her professional capabilities. Malik was with his grandmother, sparing him the additional trauma of reliving the day's events in public. The room fell silent as she walked to the front, her federal credentials case visible in her hand. The transformation from concerned parent to law enforcement official was complete and unmistakable. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying easily through the packed room. "I know you all have questions about what happened today, and I'm here to provide some answers." Walsh tried to maintain control of the meeting. "Mrs. Thompson, we appreciate your coming, but we need to follow proper procedures." "The proper procedures were followed 3 months ago when you approved my son's adaptive swing equipment." Alexis interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "What happened today was a violation of federal law, and it occurred because your enforcement officers either weren't trained properly or chose to ignore the legal requirements for accommodating disabled residents." She opened her credentials case and held it up for the room to see. "I'm Deputy Director of Presidential Protection for the U.S. Secret Service. I've spent 15 years protecting the highest levels of government from threats foreign and domestic. But I couldn't protect my own son from 2 officers who thought their authority gave them the right to assault a child." The impact of her revelation rippled through the crowd. Some residents had known that Alexis worked for the government, but most had assumed she was a mid-level bureaucrat or federal contractor, not someone with the power to coordinate investigations involving multiple agencies. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching vehicles filtered through the community center's windows. But these weren't the black SUVs of the afternoon response team. These were marked federal law enforcement vehicles, their emergency lights casting red and blue patterns across the meeting room walls. Agent Chen entered the room flanked by 2 FBI civil rights investigators and a U.S. Attorney's Office prosecutor. The federal response to the playground assault was expanding beyond simple documentation into active criminal proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Chen announced, "we're here to execute search warrants for all documentation related to the enforcement policies and training procedures of your homeowners association security personnel." The legal implications hit the board members like a physical blow. Their personal liability insurance might not cover federal civil rights violations, and the potential financial exposure could destroy the association's ability to maintain common areas and community services. Board member David Kim, who had been one of the strongest supporters of Malik's adaptive equipment, stood up with obvious anger. "Margaret, I told you months ago that we needed better oversight of the enforcement officers. I warned you that giving them too much authority would lead to problems." The internal recriminations began immediately. Board members who had remained silent during previous complaints about aggressive enforcement tactics suddenly found their voices, eager to distance themselves from the liability that was engulfing their community. "We need to revoke the enforcement contracts immediately," suggested board member Lisa Chen. "And we need to hire a civil rights attorney to review all our policies." Walsh tried to maintain order, but the meeting was dissolving into chaos, and residents demanded answers, and board members scrambled to protect themselves from potential lawsuits. The carefully constructed hierarchy of community authority was crumbling under the weight of federal scrutiny. Alexis watched the proceedings with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen similar situations unfold in other contexts. The pattern was always the same: initial denial, followed by finger-pointing, followed by desperate attempts to shift blame and minimize damage. "The federal investigation will determine criminal liability," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "But what I want to know is how we prevent this from happening to another child." The room fell silent again, despite the legal and financial chaos swirling around them. The fundamental question remained unanswered: how could a community that prided itself on family values and neighborly cooperation allow the systematic targeting of its most vulnerable members? Agent Chen stepped forward with a thick folder of documents. "Our preliminary investigation has revealed that officers Bradley and Davidson received only minimal training in disability rights and civil rights law. They were given broad enforcement authority without adequate supervision or accountability measures. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Morrison, added her own sobering perspective. We've identified at least 6 other incidents over the past year where these officers exceeded their authority or used excessive force. Today's assault on a disabled child is part of a pattern of civil rights violations that the association failed to address. The legal noose was tightening around both the individual officers and the homeowners association that had enabled their behavior. The financial settlements alone could run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, not counting the legal fees and federal oversight that would likely continue for years. But for Alexis, the money was secondary to the larger principle at stake. Her son deserved to grow up in a community where his disability was accommodated rather than criminalized, where authority figures protected rather than persecuted vulnerable residents. 3 weeks later, the transformation of the community playground was complete. The new equipment had been designed by pediatric specialists to accommodate children with a wide range of physical abilities and mobility needs. The adaptive swings were just one component of a comprehensive accessibility upgrade that had been funded through a combination of federal grants and community fundraising. The brass plaque mounted on the playground's entrance gate read simply, "Malik's Way, a place where every child can play." The name had been suggested by the neighborhood children themselves, who had campaigned for the honor of naming the playground after their friend who had suffered so much for their collective benefit. Malik stood at the entrance with his mother, both of them dressed in their Sunday best for the dedication ceremony. The red mark on his cheek had faded weeks ago, but the memory of that afternoon would stay with him forever. However, it would be balanced by this moment, when his entire community had come together to ensure that no other child would face the same discrimination and violence. The crowd gathered for the ceremony was larger than anyone had expected. Neighbors who had never spoken before the incident had formed lasting friendships through their shared outrage and determination to create change. The federal investigation had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their community, but it had also revealed their capacity for growth and redemption. Former board president Walsh, who had resigned in disgrace after the investigation revealed her negligent oversight of the enforcement officers, watched from the back of the crowd. She'd been replaced by David Kim, whose commitment to inclusive policies and accountable governance had earned him unanimous support from the community. Agent Chen was also present, representing the federal agencies that had investigated the case. Officers Bradley and Davidson had pled guilty to civil rights violations and been sentenced to prison terms that would keep them away from children for years to come. Their law enforcement certifications had been permanently revoked, ensuring they could never again abuse their authority to harm vulnerable citizens. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kim announced, his voice carrying clearly through the small speaker system they'd set up for the occasion. "We're here today to celebrate not just a new playground, but a new commitment to the values that make a community strong." He gestured toward the playground equipment, where children were already testing the new swings and climbing structures. "This playground represents our promise that every child, regardless of their abilities or challenges, deserves a place to play, to learn, and to grow alongside their neighbors." Alexis stepped forward to speak, her federal credentials now a source of community pride rather than intimidation. 3 weeks ago, my son was assaulted for the crime of being different. Today, he's surrounded by friends who celebrate those differences and a community that protects them. She looked down at Malik, who was fidgeting with excitement at the prospect of trying out the new adaptive equipment. "The playground is beautiful, but what makes it special is the community that built it. You didn't just replace some swings and slides. You replaced fear with hope, exclusion with inclusion, and hatred with love. The ceremony concluded with the ribbon cutting, performed jointly by Malik and Sarah Martinez, a wheelchair-using teenager whose family had moved to the neighborhood specifically because of its newfound reputation for accessibility and inclusion. The two children, separated by age, but united by their shared experience of disability, cut through the red ribbon together as the crowd erupted in applause. As the children scattered across the playground to explore the new equipment, Alexis found herself in conversation with other parents who had been inspired by the events to become more involved in community governance and advocacy. The federal investigation had ended, but the cultural transformation it had sparked was just beginning. Mrs. Patterson, who had been one of the first witnesses to speak up during the playground incident, approached with tears in her eyes. "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing this," she said, gesturing toward the scene of children playing together without regard for their differences. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't had the authority to fight back." Alexis nodded solemnly. "But I was there. And more importantly, all of you were there too. You didn't stay silent when you saw injustice. You didn't let fear override your moral responsibility to protect a child." The playground would serve as a permanent reminder of what could be accomplished when a community confronted its failures and committed to doing better. The federal oversight requirements would eventually end, but the cultural changes they had catalyzed would endure for generations. Malik's laughter echoed across the playground as he tested his new adaptive swing, soaring higher than ever before with complete confidence in his safety and acceptance. The sound was pure joy, unmarked by fear or hesitation, the laughter of a child who knew he belonged. 6 months later, the community had become a model for inclusive playground design and disability rights advocacy. Delegations from other neighborhoods visited regularly to learn about their transformation process, and the playground equipment manufacturer had used their specifications to develop new products for similar communities nationwide. The ripple effects extended far beyond playground equipment. The Homeowners Association had implemented comprehensive civil rights training for all vendors and contractors. They had established an ombudsman program to investigate complaints about discrimination or harassment. Most importantly, they had created a culture where challenging authority was seen as a civic duty rather than a threat to community harmony. Alexis continued her work with the Secret Service, but she also began speaking at law enforcement conferences about the importance of disability awareness and community relations. Her story became a case study in how federal intervention could catalyze positive change at the local level when communities were willing to confront their shortcomings honestly. The legal settlements had provided more than enough funding for the playground improvements, with the remainder going to establish a scholarship fund for children with disabilities and a community education program about civil rights and inclusion. The officers who had committed the assault were serving their sentences in federal prison. Their law enforcement careers permanently ended. But perhaps the most important change was the hardest to quantify: the transformation of a community's heart. The neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to chat about their children's adventures on the new playground equipment. The cultural barriers that had allowed discrimination to flourish had been replaced by genuine connections across lines of difference. On the anniversary of the playground incident, Malik stood once again at the same swing where he had been assaulted. But this time, he was surrounded by friends who had helped him overcome the trauma through their acceptance and support. The adaptive equipment that had once marked him as different now simply provided him with the tools he needed to join in the universal childhood experience of play. As he swung higher and higher, his laughter carried across the neighborhood like a bell announcing that justice, once achieved, could create joy that echoed through generations. The playground bore his name, but the legacy belonged to an entire community that had chosen love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and courage over complacency. The federal investigation had ended. The lawsuits had been settled, and the officers had been imprisoned. But the real victory was visible every day in the faces of children who played together without seeing barriers, in the conversations between parents who had learned to bridge their differences, and in the quiet confidence of a boy who had discovered that sometimes standing up to injustice meant helping others find the courage to stand up too. Malik's swing still bore the scars of that terrible afternoon. Small scratches where the officers had handled it roughly during their attempt to confiscate it. But those marks had become symbols of resilience rather than reminders of trauma. Proof that even the most important things in life sometimes had to be fought for and defended. The playground would continue to serve children for decades to come. Each generation learning the story of how their community had transformed itself through the simple recognition that every child deserved to play safely and freely. And in that recognition, they would find the foundation for a more just and inclusive society. One swing at a time.